It had been a quiet morning in Willow Creek Estates, the kind of suburban neighborhood where lawns were trimmed like golf courses, mailboxes stood perfectly aligned, and the air always carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass. For years, the place had been my sanctuary, a safe, predictable home where I could enjoy my coffee on the porch without a single worry in the world. That peace shattered the moment I opened the crisp white envelope sitting in my mailbox. The letter inside bore the official letterhead of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, embossed in gold, as if to remind me that they considered themselves the true authority here. The language was formal, almost clinical, but every sentence was laced with an undercurrent of accusation. According to them, my backyard shed something I had built years ago with the proper city permits, was encroaching on community property. The notice claimed it violated HOA regulations, posed a safety risk, and, most disturbingly, would have to be removed within 30 days. Failure to comply, they said, would result in legal action and potential forfeiture of the portion of land in question. I read the letter 3 times, convinced there must be some kind of mistake. My shed was nowhere near community property. It sat exactly where it had always been, well within my own fence line. I had the city's stamped survey from when I bought the house. I knew my boundaries. At first, I tried to shake it off as an administrative error, maybe some overzealous board member checking boxes on a clipboard. But the longer I stared at the letter, the more I could feel a knot tightening in my stomach. It wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. They weren't simply asking me to move the shed. They were laying the groundwork to take a part of my property. I decided to walk to the back of my yard, past the vegetable garden, until I stood right in front of the shed. It was a sturdy little structure, painted the same warm beige as my house, with dark green trim around the windows. I'd built it myself over the course of a summer, storing my tools and lawn equipment inside. There was nothing unsafe about it. No overhang, no hazard. The fence that enclosed my yard had been there since before I moved in, built by the previous owner. Behind it was a strip of grass that eventually connected to a walking path, HOA. Managed land, sure, but separated from mine by that fence and several feet of space. The idea that my shed crossed into their property was absurd. Still, I knew how HOA operated. I had heard the stories neighbors fined for flowers that weren't the right color, retirees forced to paint their houses twice in 1 year because the shade of blue didn't match the community aesthetic. If they wanted a fight, they wouldn't back down easily. That night, I dug through my filing cabinet until I found the manila folder from when I bought the property. Inside were the city permits for the shed, the contractor's signed statements, and most importantly, the official property survey. The survey clearly marked the boundaries with precise measurements and coordinates. My shed was over 6 feet inside my property line, nowhere near encroachment. I considered walking into the next HOA meeting and waving the survey in their faces, but something told me to wait. If this was just a blunder, it could be cleared up quietly, but if it was deliberate, I needed to be ready for whatever game they were playing. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. 2 board members passed my house slowly, clipboards in hand, jotting things down as they glanced toward my backyard. A friendly neighbor mentioned, in a lowered voice, that she had overheard the HOA president talking about reclaiming community land to expand the walking path. My lot, it seemed, was in their crosshairs. On the 7th day after receiving the letter, I came home from work to find a second envelope taped to my front door. This one was bolder. In large, block letters at the top, it read, "Final Notice." They claimed their own survey confirmed that my shed was sitting on community property by at least 3 feet. They demanded immediate removal and warned that legal proceedings had already been initiated. That was the moment it became clear this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an attack. As I held the letter, my mind raced through possibilities. If they had their own survey, it had to be flawed or deliberately manipulated. Either way, it meant they were already willing to spend HOA funds to push this narrative. And if they won, I wouldn't just lose a shed, I'd lose part of my yard permanently. I set the letter on my desk, grabbed my phone, and started calling surveyors. If they wanted to make this about boundaries, I was going to get the most airtight, indisputable boundary proof money could buy. The following morning, a local surveying firm agreed to take the job. They were thorough, sending a crew to mark every single corner of my property with precision instruments. I watched them work from my porch, the metallic glint of their equipment catching the morning sun. When the lead surveyor returned with the results, I could feel my pulse quicken. The findings were definitive. My shed was exactly where it belonged, with a full buffer from the HOA walking path. Not even an inch of encroachment. I now had 2 surveys, one from when I bought the property and one fresh from a licensed, independent firm, both proving the HOA was wrong, or worse, lying. But as I sat there with both documents spread out on my dining table, I realized something important. Facts alone wouldn't make them back down. HOA often relied on intimidation, banking on residents being too scared or too tired to fight. If I wanted to win, I couldn't just defend myself. I would have to go on the offensive, and as fate would have it, the perfect opportunity to turn the tables on them was about to fall right into my lap. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. It came in the form of a casual phone call from a neighbor named Mark, someone who had lived in Willow Creek Estates for nearly 20 years and had a sharp memory for the neighborhood's history. He wasn't exactly a fan of the HOA himself, and he had a knack for keeping track of all their blunders. Mark mentioned, almost offhand, that the strip of land behind my fence, the very piece the HOA was now claiming as theirs, had been the subject of a boundary dispute years before I even bought my house. According to him, the previous HOA board had quietly settled with a homeowner after losing a similar case. No one talked about it publicly, but the documents were out there if you knew where to look. That changed everything. If I could find proof of a prior settlement acknowledging the rightful property lines, I could show that the HOA case against me wasn't just weak. It was knowingly fraudulent. I spent the next 2 evenings digging through public records, scanning through years of meeting minutes, legal filings, and property maps. It was tedious work, but the more I searched, the more patterns began to emerge. There were notes about lot line adjustments and historic easement agreements, all buried under vague language. Then, finally, I found a scanned PDF from nearly a decade ago, detailing the settlement Mark had mentioned. In it, the HOA had acknowledged that the rear fences of several properties, including mine, marked the true property boundary. The shed's location would have been considered well within those boundaries. They had paid the previous owner's legal fees and promised to update their maps to reflect the corrected lines. That document was my silver bullet. It proved that the HOA knew the shed was not on their land, which meant this violation wasn't about enforcing rules. It was about pushing me into surrendering part of my lot for their own use. Armed with the settlement, I met with a real estate attorney. She was sharp, unflinching, and knew exactly how to handle rogue HOA. I handed her the surveys, the letter, and the settlement agreement. She read in silence, occasionally raising an eyebrow, before leaning back in her chair and saying something I'll never forget. the HOA was in far deeper trouble than they realized. She explained that by knowingly making a false claim on my property, the board could be held liable for damages, including my legal costs. And because HOA operate with pooled homeowner funds, a major payout could hit every member in the wallet. That meant the other residents, most of whom had no idea what the board was doing, would turn against them fast. The plan was simple but devastating. First, we would send them a formal demand letter, complete with every piece of evidence I had gathered. The tone would be firm but measured, giving them one last chance to withdraw their claim and publicly admit fault. If they refused, we would file a lawsuit not just to protect my shed, but to seek full restitution for the harassment, defamation of title, and legal costs. When the demand letter went out, I imagined the shock it must have caused in that boardroom. They were expecting an easy victory, a compliant homeowner who would quietly remove the shed to avoid conflict. Instead, they were facing an airtight legal case backed by 2 surveys, a prior settlement, and a determined attorney. For a few days, the neighborhood went quiet. The clipboards stopped appearing in front of my yard. The HOA president, usually seen striding confidently down the street, seemed to vanish entirely. I started to think they might have realized they were beaten, but then the counterattack came. 1 week later, I received a thick envelope via certified mail. Inside was a formal notice that the HOA intended to enter the property to remove the encroaching structure themselves. They claimed their governing documents allowed them to take corrective action if a homeowner failed to comply with a violation notice. And they gave me 72 hours to consent to the removal, or they would proceed without my approval. My attorney laughed when she saw it, not because it wasn't serious, but because it was exactly the kind of reckless move that would make them lose everything in court. She immediately filed for a temporary restraining order, halting any action until a judge could review the evidence. When the TRO was granted, the HOA plan collapsed overnight. If they had stepped foot on my property after that, it would have been considered trespassing. Instead, they were now locked into a legal battle they could not win. Behind the scenes, I could feel the tension building. Neighbors started asking questions about the legal notices they were hearing about. A few even stopped me in my driveway to ask if it was true that the HOA had been lying about property lines. I didn't give details, but I could tell the rumors were spreading. That's when the real turning point happened, not in court, but in the court of public opinion. A copy of the settlement agreement I'd found somehow made its way into the hands of several residents. By the next HOA meeting, people were demanding answers from the board, accusing them of wasting dues on a fight they couldn't win. The board tried to push back, insisting they were acting in the community's best interest. But their words rang hollow, especially after my attorney sent a second letter, this time with a draft lawsuit attached. The damages we were seeking totaled over $100,000, a number that would wipe out the HOA reserve fund entirely. The pressure was suffocating them, and I was just getting started. By the time the next HOA board meeting rolled around, Willow Creek Estates didn't feel like the same neighborhood. The carefully manicured lawns still looked perfect, but there was a heaviness in the air, a tension that made every wave from a neighbor feel a little forced. The HOA board, once smug and untouchable, now seemed almost fragile. I didn't attend that meeting in person. My attorney advised against it, saying it was better to let the legal process speak for me. But word travels fast in a small community, and by the following morning, I'd heard every detail. The board had been grilled by residents for nearly an hour. People wanted to know why thousands of dollars from the HOA budget were being spent on legal fees over a shed, especially after proof had surfaced that the land dispute had already been settled years ago. The president tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding, but his voice apparently cracked under the weight of follow-up questions. That's when the cracks began to show. One of the board members, a relatively new addition who wasn't as deeply entrenched in the clique, openly stated that they had never seen the original settlement agreement before voting to pursue action against me. She suggested, in front of everyone, that the president might have withheld that information to push his own agenda. From there, it spiraled. Neighbors started speculating about what the HOA actually wanted with that strip of land. Someone brought up the walking path expansion plan, and another mentioned that the president's real estate developer friend had recently been sniffing around the area. The whispers had grown into full-blown accusations. Meanwhile, my attorney was building the case like a fortress. Every letter the HOA sent me, every false claim, every attempt to intimidate me, it was all documented, neatly organized, and supported by hard evidence. She filed a motion to compel the HOA to produce their survey, suspecting it was done without proper permits or by someone unlicensed. When the survey finally came in, it was almost laughable. The evidence they were using was a crude drawing, unsigned, with measurements that didn't match city records. It looked less like a professional survey and more like something sketched on a napkin during lunch. My attorney's expression said it all. This was going to be easier than she thought. But the HOA wasn't giving up quietly. A week later, I woke up to the sound of heavy equipment rumbling down my street. Peeking through the blinds, I saw a landscaping crew working near the walking path, removing a row of shrubs that had been there for years. Word spread quickly that the HOA had approved preliminary work for the expansion project right in the middle of the lawsuit. It was a bold move, but also a reckless one. My attorney wasted no time filing an injunction, arguing that their continued work was an attempt to alter the disputed area before the court could rule on it. The judge agreed, issuing an order to halt all construction until the case was resolved. From that point on, every step they took seemed to backfire. The restraining order and injunction made them look like aggressors in the eyes of the community. Residents started showing up at board meetings armed with their own questions about financial transparency, misuse of funds, and conflicts of interest. A few even formed an independent homeowners committee, determined to hold the board accountable. As the pressure mounted, my attorney received a call from the HOA lawyer. They wanted to explore a resolution. On the surface, it sounded like a victory, but my gut told me they weren't interested in admitting fault. They were trying to negotiate their way out without losing face. We agreed to a meeting, but I came prepared. I brought both surveys, the prior settlement agreement, the court orders, and a complete log of every harassing notice they had sent me. I laid it all out on the table, not with anger, but with precision. The HOA lawyer looked uncomfortable. The board members shifted in their seats. The president, however, still clung to his arrogance, refusing to acknowledge that they had crossed the line. So I made it simple for them. Drop all claims, issue a written statement admitting the shed was on my property, and pay every cent of my legal fees. If they refused, we'd go to trial, and I'd seek damages that could push them into bankruptcy. They didn't give me an answer that day, but the way they left the room tight-lipped, avoiding eye contact told me they were starting to realize just how much trouble they were in. That night, as I stood in my backyard looking at the shed, I felt a shift. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about making sure they never tried to pull this stunt on anyone else. And soon, They were going to learn exactly what that would cost them. The first sign that the HOA was truly feeling the squeeze came in the form of a community-wide email. It was bland on the surface, framed as an update on ongoing neighborhood projects. But buried in the middle was a single paragraph stating that due to unforeseen legal expenses, certain planned improvements will be delayed. It didn't take much to read between the lines. My lawsuit was draining their coffers, and the residents were beginning to notice. A week later, a flyer appeared in every mailbox announcing a special assessment meeting. For those who had never tangled with an HOA before, that meant one thing. They were about to demand more money from the homeowners to cover costs. That, more than anything else, would turn the community against them. I stayed quiet, letting events unfold. My attorney's advice was clear. The more they overreached, the easier it would be to win. But behind the scenes, we were still applying pressure. We filed a motion for discovery that required them to hand over every financial document related to the case, lawyer invoices, board meeting minutes, even email communications between members. When the documents arrived, they were more damning than I had hoped. Tens of thousands of dollars had already been spent on legal fees. Not only that, but the emails revealed that the president had been pushing the case forward despite multiple board members expressing doubts. One email in particular stood out, a message from the HOA own attorney warning that their claim on my property was legally questionable at best. That single sentence would become a weapon. It showed that they knew they didn't have the law on their side, yet they had proceeded anyway. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was heating up. At the special assessment meeting, things turned ugly fast. Residents demanded to know why they were being asked to contribute hundreds of extra dollars each to cover legal expenses, when the case should have been resolved months ago. The board tried to shift blame onto me, painting me as an uncooperative homeowner standing in the way of community improvement. But the damage was already done. Enough people had heard about the prior settlement and the bogus survey to know the truth. Word of mouth had become my greatest ally. 2 days after the meeting, a neighbor I barely knew knocked on my door. She handed me a printed packet of board meeting minutes she had collected over the years. Flipping through them, I found multiple references to other residents being threatened with violations that were later proven false. It was a pattern, an HOA leadership that thrived on intimidation and control. I passed everything to my attorney, who added it to our growing mountain of evidence. The more we uncovered, the more it became clear. This wasn't just about winning my case. We were building a precedent that could dismantle the HOA abuse of power entirely. The president must have sensed that, too, because his tone shifted. He began sending me short, almost polite messages suggesting mutually agreeable solutions. But I wasn't interested in compromise for the sake of letting him save face. If we stopped now, they'd just regroup and target someone else later. So we pressed harder. My attorney sent an updated settlement demand higher than before. We now wanted not just reimbursement for legal fees, but punitive damages for harassment and bad faith. The total, just over $100,000. It was a number that would leave the HOA financially crippled, forcing them to either raise dues to painful levels or gut their reserve fund. The following week, the board held an emergency closed-door meeting. I wasn't invited, of course, but I could tell from the stormy expressions on their faces afterward that the pressure was becoming unbearable. That's when the most unexpected ally stepped forward. A former board member, someone who had resigned quietly a few years ago, reached out to me through a mutual friend. Over coffee, she told me she had left because of the president's shady dealings and bullying tactics. She also had copies of internal records that showed the president had been warned about potential lawsuits from other homeowners if his behavior continued. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. Not only could I prove the HOA acted in bad faith in my case, but I could also demonstrate a consistent pattern of abuse, ignored warnings, and reckless spending. With those documents in hand, my attorney prepared our final move. We would give them one last chance to settle quietly, if they preferred. If they refused, we'd take it to trial, where every one of these records would become public, and every homeowner in Willow Creek would see exactly what their board had been doing behind closed doors. We sent the letter on a Monday. By Thursday, the HOA attorney called to discuss terms. They were ready to surrender, but I wasn't about to let them do it on their own terms. The HOA attorney tried to sound calm when she called, but I could hear the strain in her voice. She wanted to find common ground and avoid unnecessary escalation. That was legal. Speak for one thing. They knew they were beaten, but they were still hoping to salvage anything, to keep the board from looking like complete fools. My attorney didn't give them much room to maneuver. She laid out the terms again, point by point. A written admission that my shed was on my property, payment of every cent of my legal fees, and a lump sum payout for damages. The total remained just over $100,000. No negotiations, no reductions. For a moment, the HOA side went quiet. Then came the inevitable pushback. They tried offering less, much less, arguing that the payout would bankrupt the association and hurt innocent homeowners. But my attorney was unmoved. She reminded them that this situation was entirely of their own making, and that the residents deserved to know the truth about how their dues had been wasted. While the lawyers traded letters and calls, the neighborhood itself was transforming. The once pristine HOA-controlled image of order and harmony was cracking apart. Residents were openly discussing removing the current board. Petitions were being drafted. Even the small group of hard supporters who had backed the president began keeping their distance. Then came the financial bombshell. The HOA treasurer, clearly tired of shielding the board, leaked details about the reserve account during a heated meeting. It turned out the legal fees had already chewed through a significant portion of their savings. If they didn't settle soon, they wouldn't just have to raise dues. They'd have to start cutting basic maintenance services like landscaping and pool upkeep. That revelation spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Within days, I saw groups of neighbors huddled together on sidewalks, gesturing angrily toward the clubhouse where the board met. The narrative had shifted completely. I was no longer the obstinate homeowner standing in the way of a community project. I was the person holding the board accountable for their reckless spending. When the HOA attorney called again, her tone was noticeably different. There was no talk of compromise this time, only questions about how quickly we could finalize the settlement if they agreed to my terms. My attorney told her plainly that we would move quickly, but only after they signed a binding agreement that included every condition we'd set from the start. The sticking point was the public admission. The board desperately wanted to avoid putting in writing that they had been wrong, but without it, the deal was dead. I wasn't going to walk away with just money. I wanted a permanent record that would make it impossible for them, or any future board, to pull the same stunt again. It took another week of tense back and forth before they finally caved. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning. It was signed by every member of the board and stated, in clear, unambiguous language, that the shed was entirely on my property, that their previous claims were baseless, and that they were covering all my legal costs and paying a settlement of $100,000. I read it twice, savoring each line. This was the moment the tide fully turned. But even as I held that victory in my hands, I knew the fallout wasn't over. The admission letter was now a matter of record, and once the residents saw it, the backlash against the board would be swift and merciless. Sure enough, within 24 hours of the letter being distributed to every household in Willow Creek, the neighborhood erupted. Emails flew back and forth. Social media groups lit up. By the weekend, a formal recall petition had been launched against the president and 2 other board members. For the first time in months, I walked through the neighborhood without feeling eyes on me in suspicion or hostility. Instead, people stopped to thank me. A few even apologized for believing the board's side of the story early on. But as satisfying as that was, I couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. The $100,000 settlement wasn't just a personal win. It was a warning shot to every HOA board that thought they could bully residents into submission. The board's days were numbered, and I intended to make sure they didn't go quietly. The recall meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning, and by the time I walked down to the clubhouse, the parking lot was already overflowing. Cars lined both sides of the street, and neighbors were spilling out onto the grass. It was the largest turnout I'd ever seen for anything in Willow Creek Estates. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. People clutched copies of the settlement letter, some folded neatly, others crumpled from being read and reread. The usual polite chatter of HOA gatherings was gone, replaced with a low hum of anger and determination. The president sat at the head of the long table, flanked by the remaining loyalists. He tried to wear the same confident expression he always had, but it was slipping. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles were pale. He knew what was coming. When the meeting began, the residents wasted no time. One after another, they stood up and demanded answers why the board had pursued a case they knew they couldn't win, why the prior settlement agreement had been hidden, why so much of their money had been spent on legal fees instead of maintaining the neighborhood. The president's answers were evasive, full of corporate-sounding phrases about community vision and long-term benefits. But no amount of spin could disguise the facts. The letter admitting they had been wrong was in every person's hands. The numbers showing how much they'd lost were written in black and white. It only took an hour for the vote to begin. Ballots were passed around, collected, and counted in plain view. The results were decisive. Over 70% voted in favor of removing the president and 2 other board members immediately. There was no applause, no cheering, just a grim sense of finality as the 3 of them stood, gathered their things, and walked out. The president didn't look at anyone. His once commanding presence was reduced to a silent retreat down the hallway. The remaining board members, clearly rattled, announced that an interim committee would take over until a new election could be held. The residents didn't seem to care who filled the seats as long as the old leadership was gone. After the meeting, people lingered outside in small groups. Some were already talking about auditing the HOA books, others about changing the bylaws to make it harder for any future board to spend large sums without community approval. The atmosphere had shifted, no longer a neighborhood under the control of a few power-hungry individuals, but a community ready to protect itself. For me, the moment was bittersweet. I had fought the HOA and won not just for myself, but for everyone who lived here. The shed still stood exactly where it had always been, my property line intact. The $100,000 0 settlement was safely in my account, and the admission letter was framed in my office as a reminder of what happens when you refuse to be bullied. But it had also been a long, exhausting battle. I'd spent months gathering evidence, sitting through tense strategy sessions with my attorney, and living under constant scrutiny. The victory was worth it, but it had come at a cost I wouldn't soon forget. Still, as I walked back to my house that afternoon, I noticed something I hadn't seen in months: neighbors smiling and waving without hesitation. A few stopped me to say they were glad I hadn't backed down, that my fight had given them the courage to speak up about their own grievances with the HOA. That was the real reward. The money would get spent eventually, the legal victory would fade into paperwork, but the culture of the neighborhood had shifted. People understood now that the board wasn't untouchable, and that a single homeowner with the will to fight could bring the whole machine grinding to a halt. Of course, not everyone was happy about it. Rumors swirled that the former president was threatening to sue the HOA for wrongful removal. Others said he was moving out entirely. Either way, his reign over Willow Creek was finished. I had no intention of joining the new board or getting involved in neighborhood politics. I'd fought my battle and won. My role now was to enjoy the peace I'd fought so hard to reclaim. But if another overreaching HOA ever tried to pull the same stunt again, well, let's just say I still had the name of a very good attorney on speed dial. The shed, once the center of a bitter war, now sat quietly at the back of my yard, bathed in late afternoon sunlight. A simple structure, yes, but also a symbol, not just of my property rights, but of the fact that sometimes standing your ground means changing the rules for everyone. And in Willow Creek Estates, those rules would never be the same again. The dust had barely settled from the recall vote when the true extent of the HOA financial mess became public. The interim committee, eager to show they were different from the old regime, released a full accounting of the association's budget. It was worse than anyone expected. Between the settlement pay out to me, my legal fees, and their own attorney costs, the HOA had spent over $140,000 in less than a year. That was more than half of their entire reserve fund, money that had been earmarked for pool repairs, landscaping contracts, and emergency maintenance. Residents were stunned. Those who had been neutral during the dispute now realized they'd all been paying for the president's stubbornness. Even people who had initially believed the board's story were openly admitting they'd been wrong. The numbers didn't lie. The immediate consequence was painful. Dues had to be raised temporarily to rebuild the reserve fund, and several planned upgrades, new playground equipment, security lighting along the walking path, were put on hold indefinitely. The community pool, the pride of Willow Creek during summer, would need to limp through another season before it could be resurfaced. But surprisingly, there was no backlash toward me. The blame was squarely on the ousted leadership. At every community gathering, people expressed relief that the case had been settled before the HOA burned through all the funds. Some even thanked me for stopping the board when I did, saying they hated to think how much worse it could have gotten. In a way, the financial fallout was a cleansing fire. It forced everyone to face the fact that the HOA had been operating without proper oversight for years. The interim committee wasted no time implementing safeguards, new spending approval thresholds, mandatory public disclosure of all legal actions, and a requirement for independent audits every year. For me, the victory felt complete not just because I'd kept my shed and my land, but because the HOA itself was now being rebuilt on a foundation of accountability. Still, I couldn't help but wonder how the former president was handling his fall from power. Rumor had it he'd put his house up for sale, unable to handle the humiliation of facing neighbors who now saw him as the man who bankrupted their association. I didn't go out of my way to check. My fight had been with the HOA as an institution, not with him as a person. But I couldn't deny there was a certain poetic justice in seeing the man who tried to seize my property now packing up his own. The community was healing, but the story of the HOA spectacular failure was far from over, because the real legacy of what happened in Willow Creek would be felt for years to come. A year after the settlement, Willow Creek Estates didn't look much different from the outside. The lawns were still neatly edged, the houses freshly painted, the walking paths winding peacefully through the neighborhood. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. The new HOA board, elected just months after the recall, was a far cry from the old guard. Meetings were open, transparent, and, most importantly, civil. Homeowners spoke freely without fear of being fined for minor infractions or targeted for personal grudges. The board posted budgets and project updates online, something the old leadership had never done. My case had become something of a cautionary tale. Anytime a new board member suggested stricter enforcement of a rule, someone would inevitably bring up the shed incident and remind everyone where unchecked authority could lead. It wasn't bitterness. It was a shared memory of a fight that had almost torn the community apart. The walking path expansion project, the one they had tried to use as justification for taking my land, was quietly abandoned. Instead, the HOA used the recovered reserve funds to improve the existing path, adding better lighting and benches along the way. I sometimes walked it in the evenings, passing neighbors who greeted me warmly, some with a knowing smile. As for the shed, it had become something of a landmark. Kids used it as a meeting spot when playing in the yard, and neighbors occasionally joked about putting a plaque on it, "The shed that beat the HOA." I'd laugh, but deep down, I knew it represented something far more important. A reminder that property rights aren't just words on paper, they're worth defending. From time to time, I still heard whispers about the former president. He had indeed sold his house and moved away, reportedly after a failed attempt to run for a different HOA board in another town. Apparently, his reputation had followed him. I never reached out to him, and he never reached out to me. The fight was over, and I had no interest in dragging it back up. My life had moved on. Looking back, the entire ordeal felt almost surreal. What had started with a single letter in my mailbox had grown into a legal battle, a community uprising, and a complete overhaul of how our HOA operated. And while I wouldn't wish that kind of stress on anyone, I had to admit there was a strange satisfaction in knowing that one stubborn homeowner had been able to take on an entrenched system and win. On quiet evenings, when I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee, I sometimes glance toward the shed and think about all the late nights, all the paperwork, all the tense meetings and court filings. It had been exhausting, it had been frustrating, but it had been worth every moment, because Willow Creek Estates was no longer a place where the HOA could bully its residents into submission. It was a neighborhood where people stood their ground, where the board worked for the community, not the other way around. And all it took was one shed to change everything,